Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. So let's go on to our next workshop presenter. Why don't you take a second, introduce who you are, and then tell everyone in the community how you're connected to adoption and foster care.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be a part of this conference this year and just to, be a part of this community. So my name is Chantal Hinds, and I am an attorney and policy researcher and education advocate for youth in the foster system. So sort of the way I would think of myself and how I fit into the adoptive and foster sort of family is because I've spent almost 10 years now working in and around this field. I actually started my career in Brooklyn Family Court working for the Administration for Children's Services, and then had a long education attorney career representing youth in the foster system in New York City, and now have moved on to policy advocacy to improve the educational outcomes for that population.
Now, this is a very difficult community to advocate for. We all know that the foster care system is broken.
Mhm.
What made you decide? I mean, okay, so you go to, law school, you can be an attorney. It's kind of like being a doctor. You have to pick your path. What drew you to this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I knew I wanted to go to law school to help people. I personally am not impacted by the foster system, but when I was younger, my mother passed away at a very young age. I was raised by my father, and I'm very familiar with just the disruption that can happen in a young child's life and just trying to sort of get through to the next day and the next day and the next day. So I think there's some sort of affinity there for that kind of experience, even though it's not exactly the same. But my home life did change drastically after my mom passed away. So that my father and I were both navigating this new world together. So I think there's like an affinity of what happens in a child's life when major life disruption happens and how do they go on from point A to point B. So I think that is kind of what drew me. I've always been interested in like sort of families and family law and things of that nature. So when the opportunity presented itself to work at ACS, I was really curious to explore what that might look like. Ultimately decided that wasn't the place for me and really wanted to be on the side of the youth, on the side of parents, on the side of foster parents and adoptive parents to figure out how to best support youth in the system.
Well, I see that, and I always read people's bios so that way I
Mhm,
get an idea.
mhm,
Um, you said an education attorney. What
mhm.
exactly is what is an education attorney?
Yeah,
Why that? That's pretty, to
yeah.
be very honest, I've never heard of an education attorney. That's pretty new and pretty cool to
Uh-huh.
me.
Yeah, wow. Well, welcome
I know.
to
That's why I
knowing
love
one.
doing these interviews. I learn a lot too.
Yeah, so I mean, I will have to say, to be honest, I kind of fell into the education attorney piece in my last role because I had gone into that role because I had all this experience in child welfare, and that was part of the role. And then there was this other piece of an education attorney. So basically, what I did was a lot of essentially civil rights advocacy on behalf of youth in New York City. So I worked the bulk of my work, I'd say probably like 80% was with youth in the foster system, but I also worked with other low income families in the city around everything ranging from access to school, so enrollment, dealing with discipline and making sure that kids and families' rights were protected in the disciplinary process and that they weren't being overly, schools weren't being overly punitive and eliminate and suspending kids from school when they shouldn't be. And then the bulk of my work had to do with special education law. So ensuring that students with disabilities had the services that they needed to thrive. So that could mean setting up school meetings to advocate for additional services, or even going so far as to sue the district to ensure that they provided the services or placed the child in the appropriate setting.
Aha, a light bulb moment. Okay,
Uh-huh.
education attorney. So
Mhm.
I also have personal knowledge of
Uh-huh.
special ed,
Mhm. Mhm.
and you get to the point where you bring in an advocate, and I guess you're
Mhm.
the one that we call as a
Mhm.
community of, oh, the advocate didn't work, let's go the next level.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind
Or you
of.
can start with us.
when people just get to that point where they say they want an attorney, it's like, well, just
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Mhm.
wonderful. So
Mhm.
that's a pretty deep, that's a deep dive. Special
Yeah.
education, especially for foster care children and
Yes.
teens is, I hate to use the word a mess, but it's a mess.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
special
Mhm.
education system is not um, all that it can be. And,
Right.
and I was having a discussion with someone recently that the parents, I always say that like, they don't give you a book a manual that tells
Mm.
you. And even if it did, it doesn't say
Mhm.
it to the point where you know what your rights are. So
Yes.
um, what do you feel, you say so many times the word improve and advocate for,
Mhm.
why do you feel in your experience that the foster care community is the one that seems to be the one that suffers the most in in
Mhm.
all types of education systems?
Mhm. Mhm. I think it's a complicated question with a complicated answer in some ways. I think that just sort of eliminating foster care for a second, the whole sort of premise of education access in our country is really built upon parents being advocates and parents being able to go to school and ask for certain things and apply for certain programs and things of that nature. When that parent child relationship is broken for whatever reason, whether it's the foster system or some other life circumstance, you don't have that sort of assumed built-in advocate in the education sort of puzzle to do the things that parents ordinarily would do, go to parent teacher conference, even, that small thing, right? So when you have a child who enters the system who maybe doesn't have stability in their placement, or just hasn't been in a home or a foster home at all. Maybe they've been in a group home where they don't get that support that they need, then it's much easier for them to fall through the cracks because no one is actually monitoring and watching them and paying attention to their progress and showing up at school when something goes wrong and defending them when maybe the school has overreached and they need to be pulled back and reined in. So I think part of it is that just the overall structure of the way education works. And then I think the other piece of it is just a sort of like underestimation of the trauma that youth feel and young people experience in this system, and sort of the resolve, like I talked about my experience, the resolve it takes to show up to school and put out these very traumatic things that have happened in your life outside of school, and show up and perform as a student, or show up and be quiet all day, or show up and not have an outburst like that is extremely difficult. And in so many of these situations, I think that sometimes, not all teachers, but sometimes teachers or school staff can look at sort of behavioral manifestations of trauma and sort of say, well, this kid is being a bad kid, or something of that nature. And no, actually, when you sit down and think about it, they're having a rational reaction to something that has happened in their life, and it's coming out in this way. And what they really need is like the tools to learn how to cope. So I think there's like a couple of different things at play that makes the educational outcomes for this population so challenging. And then there are and that sort of calls on the school systems, calls on agencies to do more to support them so that they can show up to school and actually learn. They can show up to school and feel safe. They can show up to school and feel seen. And be able to do the things that they themselves want to do. There's tons of data out there, like, so many kids in the system want to go on to college, but then the number that actually do is small. And then the number that actually graduate is even smaller. So how do we like support them and create a safe environment so they can show up and do what they need to do?
Yes, trauma informed schools is
Hmm.
something that I really wish people would grab onto.
Yeah.
It's so hard that when you go into a CSE meeting and you're
Hmm.
trying to explain, you don't understand. I understand he does have some challenges, maybe has some disabilities, but at the same
Hmm.
time, if you do XYZ, that helps with the trauma piece. Trauma,
Hmm.
oh my goodness.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
very disheartening
Hmm.
because it's thrown around too much.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I always say that trauma is very different to very different people. I mean,
Yes.
I used to joke, and I hate I used to say, like, a paper cut to one person is,
Right.
you know, getting your arm
Mhm.
chopped off by someone else. I don't even
Right.
know how to say it right.
Right.
Everybody
Mhm.
receives it differently. So you
Mhm.
can't just discount what these children, teens,
Mhm.
adults, everyone has been through.
Mhm.
But going on to your topic,
Mhm.
and the workshop title,
Mhm.
Improving Education for Young People in Foster Care in New York State, Listening to Those with Lived Experience. Give us an idea of what kind of things you'll be diving into during your presentation.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to share this with this community. So I set out on this goal of like talking to people in New York State and figuring out, okay, what can our school systems do better to improve educational outcomes? What do you, as a current or former foster youth, say, like, I wish when I showed up to school, this is what I had. I wish I had this program. I wish this teacher, even an individual teacher, was more supportive. I wish I had a guidance counselor. I wish I had a mentor. So we kind of do a lot of this work in the child welfare system and the foster system without the voices of the people who are most impacted. So my position has been, always will be, if we want to know how to fix something, we should ask the people who are experiencing the issue. So I really wanted to talk to as many current and former foster youth as I could, foster parents, adoptive parents, and parents as well, to figure out, okay, what do you wish you had? As a parent of a child in the system, like, how do you wish you were still involved in your child's life if you're moving towards reunification? Like, how would that have impacted the way that things went for you? If you're a foster adoptive parent, how did you feel like you could advocate for your child while they were in the system? What did you feel your role was? What did you wish you had? So I conducted all these interviews, spoke with over 75 participants in and around, mostly in New York City, but also like up in the Buffalo area, and really just try to figure out like what would make a supportive school system. So I'm excited to share those findings with folks who come to the workshop. It'll be the first time they'll be shared. They won't be public before then, so it's an exclusive for the conference. But I'm excited to share and it's also because I love the theme of this year's conference, Courageous Conversations, because these were courageous conversations of people. I had so many current and former foster youth in these interviews and focus groups say to me, like, no one ever asked me. Like, no one ever asked. No one ever cared what I thought. They just said, we're doing this or we're doing that. So, like, for them to open up and share their thoughts, their ideas, their suggestions was very courageous of them. And I want to like honor that and share that with folks so that they can hear, like, these are some of the things that the population is thinking about. And these are some of the things you can think about as you approach advocating for them in school, as you approach sort of having conversations with school staff that maybe you weren't as inclined to have initially. Maybe you can push back on some things that they say, or suggest ideas that schools consider, in your local community when it comes to working with your children.
So the last thing, just tell everybody out there why, like, so a lot of times we ask on here are the intended audience
Mhm.
and why. And I always say all workshops are for everybody to hear.
Right.
Why do
Mhm.
you feel that everyone needs to hear about your topic, no matter who they are?
Yeah, I think the main reason everyone needs to hear about the topic is because these are the voices of people with lived experience. And those are voices that are always worth hearing. Those are voices that are always worth highlighting. And those are insights that you can only get if you live the experience. So, really hearing directly from, or directly via me, but from through my research, hearing what they had to say, their experiences, their recommendations. You're not going to know that unless you go interview 75 people, which I guess you could. But I think it's really important to listen to the voices of lived experts and give them sort of the position that they deserve as like legitimate experts on this issue and legitimate partners in solutions to problems.